I was immediately struck by how fresh and alive the prints were. I mean, looking at work that was made so long ago, you know, looking at work from the 50s, 70s, and right at the end of Patrick's life, at the end of the 90s, and how alive at a time when, I mean, certainly for me, and I think for pretty much everybody in this room, things have been pretty dead. So I think, first of all, that was the first impression I had. In a way, this is an amazing exhibition because it's looking at an aspect of Patrick's work that has been very little attended to at all. I mean, as you mentioned in your text, hardly anybody has written about Patrick's prints in the past, and neither did Patrick, certainly not published. And
nor, in fact, did he actually say anything very much, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Or not to me,
Yeah.
but to you.
No, not to me either. So it was, in a way, seeing these three periods in front of us, right at the end of his life, period when he was, you know, apparently, to most people, in the vanguard of making a new kind of abstract painting in the 50s, and period in the 70s where he was pushing his work in painting in new directions as well. And what this told me very immediately was the sense to which Patrick used media in very particular ways at very particular times. You know, for him, an oil painting or a gouache or a print were equal in status. They had equal purpose. And, you know, certainly looking at the gouaches alongside his oil paintings, thinking about what the conversations are that are going on at the times he's making the gouaches and the period he's making the paintings. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't, but quite often, looking at the gouaches, what's going on in those paintings informs his paintings maybe 2-5 years later in ways that one doesn't quite can't realize at the time. And he talked about that and he wrote about that, and I feel that there's something similar going on with the prints as well. And it's just really curious that it's never quite been picked up on. You know, these three periods are very significant moments in his career, in his life. And he's pushing things with these prints in ways that he can't explore what he's exploring in the prints exactly in the paintings. They're not like a transcription of what he was doing at that time in the 70s. And I think certainly looking at the screen prints, it's really apparent. You know, these are, on the face of it, they are like echoes in parallel of the paintings that he's making, but they are completely and utterly different. And the key difference is in the surface of the prints. When you compare that to the surface that he's achieving in the paintings, which huge washes of colour created with small watercolour, Japanese watercolour brushes to create these eddies of paint within these huge, large fields of colour. So there's constant inflection and activity going on in these colour fields, which in the prints, it's a field of colour. It's a sleek surface. It's a completely different experience to the experience that you're having with the paintings. And yet the places, the points at which, the lines at which the colour areas meet, the colour shapes meet, is very, very similar. You know, it's like the way he painted was to make sure there would be no point at which colour overlaps colour. They meet exactly. And you could achieve that with these fine watercolour brushes. And similarly with the screen prints, it's, you know, working with the master printer like Chris Prater, you're, you know, it's all in the sense, in the registration, I guess.
Yes. It's in my essay, I think I say that Patrick famously referred to the continent of colour, which is still unexplored, and which was the great area which painting still had to explore. And I go on to say that if that's true of painting, then in terms of Patrick's own work, these prints are pretty well terra incognita, because they just haven't been surveyed or written about or considered. Well, I suppose my first impression is that there are a lot of them. They're very impressive. This is a substantial body of work, which is also intermittent. I think that's what, well, you've got to read the labels and the dates, but actually there were long periods when Patrick Heron wasn't making prints, and I wonder what the factors were. I suspect that one of them was probably luck, whether you've got to meet the right printmaker who's able to do the things which match the work you're doing at that moment for it all to come together. And for example, between the late 50s and the mid 60s, there's nothing. And possibly the kind of paintings he was doing then didn't lend themselves to the kind of print media which were available to him. And there's also personalities come into it. It was obviously important to encounter Chris Prater at Culpra, and it's not a given that there's going to be a printmaker you can work with who can do just what you need. So I think that probably the calculus was to do with whether printmaking happened or not, was to do with luck, was it chance, whether he'd encountered somebody who he could work with, and also whether what he was doing lent itself to it. And he also famously referred to the 60s to 70s works, like the one behind me, as wobbly hard edge. And I suppose in that case, the phase before was soft edge. And I don't know whether there's a print medium in which he could adequately have produced colour soft edge prints at that date. Alan might know, but I mean, I wonder if that he didn't, and I wonder if the.
I mean, I guess maybe in the late 50s, you know, the work that opens the exhibition, the lithographs upstairs, you know, the lithography process is something that can approximate a kind of, you know, the layering of brushstrokes, which you kind of, but I think it would be very, very difficult to find a print medium that would really answer what he's doing, but also push it further in the way that screen printing gives. It's not, as I was saying, not just a replication in print of the sorts of paintings he was doing. They are categorically or characteristically different. And maybe the lithographs were, you know, in one sense, maybe disappointing in the sense that they didn't push the paintings somewhere else. They were almost a kind of echo.
Perhaps. I rather like them, actually.
Yeah, no, I think they're great. But I think that might be part of the problem. I think luck is part of it. Also, he was in the late 40s rather, did a number of monoprints, which is, you know, it's a different approach to printmaking than editioning, but at the same time it shows that he's trying to think about the print medium in relationship to his painting, and there's a lithograph and etching from the early 50s that you mentioned that he, subsequent to a trip to Assisi. So
yes, he did a rather sort of Ben Nicholson-ish
yes.
etching at that point. It was pointed out to me that the process of making textile designs is very akin to making print. So really, he was doing that from an extremely early age, and producing a design for.
I mean, it's sort of on retainer, as it were, to Cristea
Exactly,
till the early 50s, I guess.
So printmaking must have been something actually rather natural to him.
Yeah.
But perhaps we should say something about, I mentioned this wobbly hard edge categorization, which applies to quite a lot of the works around us. And that seems to me quite an interesting formulation in that it situates him in a sort of mid-Atlantic fashion, that hard edge is probably in origin essentially an American idiom, and Lawrence Alloway had picked up the term, and it was applied to Robin Denny's work and sort of various sort of people in Situation in 1960 exhibition and so on. So hard edge is American, but the wobbly bit seems to me, as from things he said and also just from looking at the works, that's much more Gallic. That comes from French graphic modes and Matisse and Bonnard and so forth. So he's managed to find a balance between two currents in these works, which is, I suppose, the majority of the prints are in that idiom.
Yeah. I mean, I think that balance that you point out is crucial to the way Patrick's work develops, I think, over through the 50s and subsequently, because he, as an artist, he was somebody who formed his manner very much in conversation with the French modern masters, Picasso, Braque, Bonnard, Matisse, Vlaminck. And by the mid-50s, I think pretty much sparked very much through his connection with Clement Greenberg, who he met in 1954 and had a kind of friendship with, mainly through correspondence, though with irregular meetings. He formed his work very much at different times as a synthesis of the sort of transatlantic manner and the French modern masters. And there's a sense in which the way he responded to American painting, say in 1956, was always, though he was painted at the time as very much a champion for American painting, it was always couched in this sense of slight dissatisfaction, or more than slight dissatisfaction, about what the American painting was achieving.
Yes, he definitely had reservations, which he wrote about not quite the first viewing of abstract expressionism in Britain, but one of the first big ones in, was it 56 at Tate, and he writes that it's very interesting to see a great big Jackson Pollock and Rothko and so forth for the first time, but there are certain things about them which he has quite serious doubts about. Doesn't like the surface, doesn't like the shallow depth, I think, as well.
Yeah, colour tonalities being a bit pat, these sorts of things. The surface too simply conceived. And I think, again, that sense of surface is key. It's like in a way, thinking of that sense of what a wobbly hard edge is. It is hard edged, but it's asymmetrical. And I think part of the issue about the response to American painting as it develops in Britain in the late 50s and through the 60s, the early 60s especially, and I think centered around a group of painters who exhibited a situation. Artists like Robin Denny, Bob Law, Gillian Ayres, Bernard Cohen, Harold Cohen. These are a lot of them made work which Lawrence Alloway described at the time as heraldic, and so it's quick. It was sort of fast to paint, fast to receive, and as heraldic, like a badge. So, and a badge is quite often pretty much symmetrical. And you think of Robin Denny's compositions, for example, as being quite symmetrical. Bernard Cohen's at that time, similarly as well. And this symmetry was something that I think was one of the characteristics of American painting as supported by Greenberg and Greenberg's followers, which Patrick really reacted very forcibly against. It was, asymmetry, a sort of recomplication of each painting at every point within that painting was something that was absolutely key to him. And so the sense of the hard edge being wobbled in that way was absolutely by the time he was making those paintings at the end of the 60s and through the first half of the 70s, I think the situation that he had, his standpoint with regard to American painting was completely reversed from the period in the late 50s that he'd held to. But at the same time, I think abstract painting itself was in a strange place in the 70s. I mean, at the time of the late 50s, the painting held a sort of primacy. By the 70s, it was a period when other forms of art really held sway, conceptual art being prime amongst
certainly,
that.
yes, it was the ex-avant-garde, whereas in
exactly.
1960-65, Robin Denny and Richard Smith were probably the two. I mean, if you'd ask somebody to say who's the hottest young artist in Britain, they would have probably come up with one of those two names.
And I think that generational thing is really important to bear in mind, because in a sense, Patrick was reacting as far as he was reacting just purely to American painting, which he wasn't. He was reacting to lots of things. But in terms of American painting, his reaction was happening at the same time as those artists as well in the late 50s, Richard Smith, Robin Denny, etc. And
yes,
they were a generation younger than him. And
well, I'd say crucially half a generation. It wasn't a huge gap, but it was enough of a gap to make a difference.
Yeah.
Maybe 10 years less.
10 years, yes. Yeah. And I think that there was also a sense of not only a generational gap, half gap going on, it was also an aesthetic gap going on as well. It's sort of where your aesthetics are founded, where have they come from, and also where do you situate yourself as well. I think Patrick's the moves that Patrick made in his art in the mid-50s are moves that are made outside of London, basically. The moves that are made by artists like Robin Denny are moves made in London. It's a very different kind of aesthetic.
They tend to be, with the exception of Gillian, actually, who probably doesn't fit into situation. They tend to be urban artists, and they tended to look to New York rather than Paris. Richard Smith went straight off to spend a year in New York, and I think probably your roots, your environment are quite important in all this. I've talked to, you mentioned this heraldic, emblematic aspect of hard edge. I talked to Frank Stella about that, and he said, well, yes, it comes out of growing up in New England and looking at those sort of frame houses and the signs, and America's just like that. Yeah. And the view from Eagle's Nest isn't like that, and it's full of Bronze Age stones and fields and things. So that was probably in that half a generation. That was when people stopped looking to Paris and started looking to New York. That was.
Yeah. I think because Patrick was somebody who looked to Paris, started looking at New York as well at the same time, and fashioned his art through that conversation and pushed it forward. By the end of the 60s, he believed that his generation of artists in Britain were the artists that were going to push forward the achievements of the American painters in a sense, but push it forward away from what Greenberg had kind of steered the ship.
Yes, well, his friendship then, falling out with Greenberg is quite interesting. Greenberg obviously was dictatorial, and lots of people fell out with him. He was also quite engaging, I thought, when I met him, and he wasn't Anglophobe artistically, actually. He, I spent an afternoon talking to him, so it wasn't sort of extensive experience, but that he'd just seen a painting by minor pre-Raphaelite Arthur Hughes in a window on Fifth Avenue, and it struck him as really good. He went through the world looking at things and thinking that's really good or that isn't really good, and he had interesting things to say about Francis Bacon. He looked hard, and he didn't dismiss British art. That's probably why he was in St Ives. Perhaps we should say something about that generation, hard edge, pop, and so on, 60s generation, and silkscreen, because that was really the. Alan's actually pointed out to me that was the idiom of the era for printmaking.
Yeah, when I think of printmaking in the 60s, I think I immediately think of pop prints in a way, because of the way the medium of silkscreen really fitted into that kind of pop urban aesthetic, and it's also silkscreen is the medium of mass print, can be medium of mass printing as well. So it was like source and medium coming together for a lot of those artists, and for abstract painting as well. Hard-edged abstract painting.
But Patrick's maybe slightly subverting it, but he's also getting very, very tight edges with which was the tight edges, as I understood it from his explanation, were the problem with the painting, because it was painting these works, which he did, of course, with tiny Japanese brushes. If you overlapped, then you got a line, and the line was absolutely what he didn't want. So it was very tricky going up to the edge and not going over it, but probably much easier with these, actually.
Yeah. Properly registered, there's no real overlap.
But this, which was an aquatent with etching, much more atmospheric, and there is a bit of a line there, actually.
There is, and I think there's, this is at the point where he's, I think, trying to think about getting the brush back into action a bit more, and so trying to have more of a sense of touch within the surface of the print, rather than pure surface, which I think the silk screens are delivering.
Yeah, in a way, they reduce the conversation about colour to absolute essence. There's nothing else except.
Yeah, and it's really clear. I mean, you look at the way in which the editions are formulated with, in a sense, the same design produced in different colorways. Yeah, which again goes back to the early design and textile design in a way. But thinking about that, how the shift, obviously the shifts in colours are something which completely alter and change the character of each print. Even though the design is the same, the colours have totally, had their full effect. But it's also something that is quite hard to do with painting. Once you make the choice of what colour goes down in what area, it's very difficult to shift it.
Well,
whereas here, it's a relatively quick process.
Yes, he would have had to do the same drawing as sort of a basic layout on a fresh canvas and get it the same, which might have been quite challenging.
Yeah,
I think.
Very sort of, not much point almost.
So can I just push that a bit further and
Sure.
say, what do you think then Patrick could get out of printmaking that he couldn't achieve in painting, aside from your edges, your very clean edges? Was there anything you feel he could achieve? Maybe looking at colour or...
I think it is about the ease of seeing different combinations of colour together on, as it were, the same design. That's one thing. I think the other thing is that when you're making a painting and activating the space through colour, but also through using these Japanese watercolour brushes, you are achieving a different kind of surface. What I was sort of alluding to earlier. And the surface of these prints are, a category shift away from the sorts of surface they are that he was achieving with his paintings. And I think that is something that he was pushing. It's like he first approached it in the late 60s with the prints he made at Winchester School of Art. Then with Chris Prater's help through the 70s, until he reaches this point and shifts from silkscreen to etching and using aquatint to try and break up that surface again. In the same way that thinking about the gouaches he was making through the 70s, they have the idiom of the wobbly hard edge, but because gouache acts in a completely different way, and relative to the size of the painting, he's using much larger brushes than he was using for large expanses of canvas. The end result is very, very different. The paint moves in a different way, it reacts in a different way, and the surface is different as a result.
Yes, I think building on what we said about the colourway, doing the colourways is one thing which could only be done with the silk screen process, but I think as I've understood the way he worked on them, it was possible he had an idea about what the colours would be, that then he'd work with the printmaker so he could fine-tune it in a way that actually you couldn't with a painting, because once you'd started cobalt or something, you just had to carry on for the whole area. But so the choice had to be made in advance, and here it was maybe possible to modulate a bit
and run off proofs that aren't then pursued, that where the colour combinations don't work in the way that he wanted. I mean, that would have been a really great discussion to have had with him about why he was making the choices he was making over the prints that were editioned and the prints that weren't editioned. Yeah. It's impossible to answer unless there's...
Yes. I suppose by the late 60s, it had become much more of a normal thing for artists to produce a lot of prints. It was a new market. I think it was a new market which was, again, this is information or ideas that Alan suggested to me, that it was really something which started in New York and then spread to London. So it became more of an expected thing for an artist to do, to produce prints. But that doesn't explain exactly why each artist should choose each particular kind. Yes. Medium.
Do you think you could compare what he was doing in terms of variation and colourway with what was going on with Joseph Albers?
Well, his name popped into mind when just now. I suppose so.
I think in terms of the colour experimentation, there is a connection. But I think the thing about Albers is that there's a given composition that is constant and repeated, whereas here that's not the case. I mean, at all. You know, it's in a way it's a different sort of heraldry going on with Albers' work.
Yes. Well, yes. The composition he related very much more to Braque or Bonnard or somebody, and it was done quickly and intuitively. He did drawings, and what he said to me was that he related it to a conversation he'd had with Braque in Braque's studio in, I think, 1947, in which Braque had large canvases on his easels and also some small, very thickly painted ones. And Patrick asked, why are those treated in such a different way to the others? And Braque said, those are to express direct emotion, whereas the big things on the easel were after contemplation. So Patrick's take on that with his wobbly hard edge was that the composition was expressed direct emotion, that he did it very, very quickly on bits of paper and then on the canvas very quickly, he said in 30 seconds or so, and under pressure, because if he messed it up, he messed up the canvas. Whereas the rest of it was done rather slowly and in a much more contemplative way. So that's all more French, whereas the Albers thing is more a sort of systematic Bauhaus approach to...
Can we talk about the last series of prints a little bit? The brushwork series around the corner here.
Yeah, I mean, they were done right at the end of his life, and I think it's hard now to look back on, but his painting was changing again. It had changed through the 90s, and through the 80s and 90s. Making a very different painting to the wobbly hard edges of the 70s. A painting that was much freer, that in a way painted from the arm rather than from the wrist, and a painting that drew closely, I think, together the different approaches he'd taken to painting throughout his career. It's sort of very much a sort of a summation, but also moving forward as well. Their paintings, the prints are seemingly again done very quickly, but they're not.
Yes. Well, as I understand it from the process, the image was done quite quickly, and then there was a process of thought about how to turn this into a print.
Yeah.
What colours to use, for example.
Yeah. So again, that dialogue of the quickness and then the contemplation. It's sort of always making paintings, making prints, making work that is nuanced in every way. I mean, there's a sort of doing one thing and then doing something completely different, achieving a kind of, a complication of the activity and a complication of the painting or the print or
yes.
the...
Yes, his evolution often seems to just sort of explore something to the absolute limit and then make a jump.
Yeah, I mean, it's like make it, you know, in the mid '60s, for instance, making this claim, I never draw, and then picking up a pencil or a pentel to actually map out a composition, rather than previously, you know, sort of in the 50s and early 60s, making paintings that accrue from the activity of painting, you know, sort of pushing the composition around with the paint, with the colour, to then, you know, so there's that sense of, I guess, by the early 60s, making paintings where those decision making, quick and slow, is happening all at the same time, if that can be the case, to again splitting it out again, you know, do the quick drawing and then not, and it's it's saying you're doing one thing and then do the other.
Yes, well, that's very much like an artist.
Yeah.
Well, I think he said that the act of writing in the introduction to, I think, an exhibition in Zurich, that this formulation of the rules of what he was doing at that time and how he never do, seemed to exhaust his desire to work like that.
Yes.
So he started working in a different way almost immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah, these, I mean, while not being pictures of field systems and cliffs and so forth, do have a feeling of sort of. I mean, as I remember, when you look down from Eagle's Nest, you look down to a sort of plateau. There's a sort of drop of several hundred feet, and then there's a plateau with all sorts of fields, and then another drop down to the sea. So you've got landscape spread out below, and also these sort of involved paths and hedges and all sorts of wobbly lines all over the terrain. I think the answer, the honest answer, is that all that sort of thing must seep into what you do, in a way, that was what Frank Stella was saying about his stripes, really, that it came from what surrounded him.
No, I think that is the case. I mean, in the mid '50s, he wrote somewhere how, you know, in Cornwall, the horizon is very present. Just as in London, you know, his eye would be drawn, say, to a stucco wall, a bit of stucco moulding or something like that, as being very present as part of, you know, if you like, London streetscape. But I think also, I mean, he was the type of artist who wasn't making paintings of the landscape, of the world he was in, but he was inhabiting that world, and so his paintings are, in a sense, a bringing together of those experiences. You know, it's like the reality of the world he lives in and experiences are brought into, as it were, the pictorial realities of the painting or the print that he's making as well. And it's not that one is a representation of the other. It's a fusing of the realities, you know, the visual responsiveness, you know. And he was somebody who was absolutely crucially visually alert to the world. You know, and he felt it deeply, and the paintings are in part a result of that kind of visual intelligence that he had. And, you know, the world of court, you know, the world in which he lived in was a place that you can't help responding to as well.